When Soviet troops entered one of the Ahnenerbe headquarters in Berlin in May 1945, they found something that did not appear in any war report. On the floor of a room lay several soldiers of Mongoloid appearance, without any insignia, without any documentation that could identify them. All of them carried ceremonial daggers of a design unknown to the Soviet army, and their bodies were arranged in a circle, with their heads joined in the center, forming a kind of wheel. No one knew then who they were. No one knows for sure, even today. The only clue refers to the expedition that the zoologist and SS officer Ernst Schäfer, born in Cologne on March 14, 1910, led to Tibet between April 1938 and August 1939 under the direct sponsorship of Himmler. Schäfer was an explorer of proven ability. He had participated in 2 previous expeditions to Tibet, the first in 1930 to 1931 and the second in 1934 to 1936, both led by the American explorer Brooke Dolan II. He knew the routes, the climates, and the lingua francas of the region, and above all, he had established relationships with Tibetan officials who had opened doors to him that were closed to most Westerners. In August 1937, Himmler signed a memorandum ordering the Ahnenerbe to equip a new expedition to Tibet, formally subordinated to the SS. Schäfer's initial project was scientific: zoology, botany, geomagnetism. But the Ahnenerbe added its own requirements. The September 1937 memorandum called for the expedition to include a geographer, an anthropologist, a geologist, a botanist, a representative of the Welteislehre, the world ice theory, which claimed that ice was the fundamental substance of all cosmic processes, and a prehistorian. Schäfer refused to include Edmund Kiss, the main advocate of Welteislehre within the Ahnenerbe, because the theory was scientifically absurd. Himmler accepted the condition, but the expedition remained under his control. The team that departed from the port of Genoa on April 21, 1938, aboard the Italian steamship Gneisenau, consisted of 5 men: Schäfer as director, Karl Rienert as geophysicist in charge of magnetic measurements, Ernst Krauss as entomologist and photographer, Edmund Gear as equipment technician and supply chief, and Bruno Beger, the SS anthropologist whose research program revolved around a question that had never had and could never have a valid scientific answer. Could a morphological correlation be established between the Tibetan population and the supposed ancestors of the Aryan race? Beger had his answers prepared in advance. On the way to Tibet, he began building his methodology. In Sikkim, he was already taking measurements. Upon arriving in Lhasa in January 1939, the team was received by the Tibetan regent, Reting Rinpoche, who ruled on behalf of the 14-month-old Dalai Lama, who would not be enthroned until 1940. In the Tibetan capital, Beger deployed his measuring equipment with a systematic approach that would later be noted for its chilling coldness. He measured 376 people. He took plaster casts of the faces, hands, and ears of 17 of them. He recorded fingerprints from another 350. He filmed and photographed rituals. He attended Losar, the Tibetan New Year, when tens of thousands of pilgrims filled the approaches to the Potala Palace in a dense human tide amid clouds of juniper incense. What Schäfer also did was closely study the rituals of the Kalachakra, the Wheel of Time Tantra, one of the most complex initiations in Tibetan Buddhism. The Kalachakra involves several days of visualization practices, purification rituals, and spiritual vows. Its cosmology is built upon the legend of Shambhala, the mythical kingdom from which a warrior king will emerge to wage the final battle of the world. For Nazi occultists who had read Ossendowski, Roerich, and Guénon, Shambhala was the Tibetan equivalent of Agartha, the subterranean realm of higher spiritual masters. And the Kalachakra was the initiation manual of its guardians. Schäfer wrote an exhaustive report on the ritual. In the interrogation conducted by the United States Military Intelligence Service in February 1946, the US FETO-I-FIR final interrogation report, Schäfer specifically recalled that Himmler had asked him about the Kalachakra and that he had provided a detailed description. He also remembered that Himmler read it with the focus of someone taking operational notes, not of someone satisfying intellectual curiosity. That section of the interrogation remains partially restricted. The expedition returned to Germany on August 4, 1939, with war only 3 weeks away. Himmler was waiting at Tempelhof Airport with the Totenkopfring, the skull ring, to personally present it to Schäfer. He appointed the zoologist director of the new SS Institute for Inner Asian Research, the Forschungsstätte für Innerasien und Expeditionen im Ahnenerbe der SS. In 1943, Schäfer renamed the institute after the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, who had visited Tibet in 1907. The choice of name was a statement of academic ambition, not a renunciation of Himmler's priorities. What happened between 1939 and 1945, between Schäfer's institute, the Kalachakra rituals, and the bodies found in 1945, cannot be established through primary documentation. What can be stated with certainty is that when the Americans found the Ahnenerbe facilities at the end of the war, the records concerning the materials brought from Tibet, the contacts cultivated during the expedition, and the institute's later activities had been destroyed or evacuated. The bodies arranged in a circle with ceremonial daggers. They were not soldiers of any recorded army. They were not prisoners. They were inside, not guarded from the outside. The wheel formation, with heads joined at the center, corresponds to specific ritual arrangements in certain practices of Vajrayana Tantric Buddhism, the same lineage to which the Kalachakra belongs. The Smithsonian Institution, consulted by researchers in the 1990s, could not establish any direct documentary connection. Soviet archives on what was found in the Ahnenerbe facilities in Berlin remain largely declassified. In the summer of 1931, a young German researcher named Otto Rahn arrived in the village of Montségur in the French Pyrenees with a backpack and a copy of Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival. He was 25 years old and convinced that the Holy Grail was not a cup but a stone, and that this stone lay somewhere beneath the mountains of the Languedoc. It was not just a personal obsession. Years later, the SS would finance his research. Montségur was the last stronghold of the Cathars, the heretical movement that at the beginning of the 13th century dominated southern France and northern Italy with a Manichaean theology that rejected the material world as a creation of evil. In 1244, after a 10-month siege by 20,000 soldiers of the Inquisition, the 500 survivors of Montségur refused to recant and were burned alive in the field that has since been called the Camp dels Cremats. The records of the Inquisition, preserved in Rome, state that the night before the surrender, 4 Cathars descended with ropes down the steepest ravine of the mountain, the Lacet, carrying something of vital importance. The documents named 3 of them, Amiel Alicard, Hugo, and Poitevin. Rahn spent months exploring the caves of the Sabathes at the foot of Montségur, guided by Antonin Gadal, a local scholar who had dedicated decades to mapping the underground system. In his book Crusade Against the Grail, published in 1933, Rahn described his findings with a mixture of descriptive rigor and unverifiable conclusions. Himmler read it. In 1935, Rahn was recruited into the SS with the rank of Untersturmführer. Himmler had designated a specific hall in Wawelsburg Castle to store the Holy Grail once it was found. It was not a metaphor. It was a physical space with a pedestal waiting for the object. Rahn continued his expeditions to the Pyrenees with SS funding and published his second book in 1937, Lucifer's Court. In that text, he wrote that he would always remember Montségur and the Grail, and he publicly admitted that he would have preferred never to have come to know them. On March 13, 1939, the SS published an announcement in a German newspaper stating that Otto Rahn had died of hypothermia in the Tyrolean mountains. He was 32 years old. No one who knew him ever fully believed that version. In May 1979, the German magazine Die Welt published for the first time an alternative version that had circulated for decades in research circles. Rahn may have survived and continued working under a false identity for German intelligence, possibly as Rudolf Rahn, a Nazi diplomat who operated in Italy and Tunisia during the war. The physical similarities between the two men fueled the hypothesis for years. The German government has not declassified Otto Rahn's complete files, and the Grail of Montségur, if it ever existed as a physical object, was never found. On the floor of a cave in the Sabathes, Rahn had photographed in 1931 a panel with symbols engraved in stone that included a cup and a spear. In Wolfram von Eschenbach's poem that had guided his search, the Grail and the Lance of Longinus always appear together. The same panel still exists today. The cave can be visited. The stone is there. What it means remains debated. On Christmas 1944, the telephone rang in the home of brothers Walter and Reimar Horten. On the other end of the line was Siegfried Knemeyer, deputy to the head of the Luftwaffe and responsible for the Reich's most advanced aviation projects. The conversation was brief. Knemeyer asked whether they could build an aircraft with a range of 11,000 kilometers. The Hortens said yes. Neither of them knew at that moment what exactly that aircraft was for. Walter Horten had been born in Bonn in 1913, Reimar, his younger brother, in 1915. From childhood, they had been obsessed with an aerodynamic concept that conventional engineers considered marginal: the flying wing, an aircraft without fuselage or tail, where the lifting surface was the body of the aircraft itself. They began building gliders at the ages of 15 and 17 in the Bonn Flying Club in a Germany that was explicitly forbidden from using military aircraft under the Treaty of Versailles. That restriction did not stop their work. On the contrary, without the pressure of immediate military requirements, they designed with absolute freedom. Their first machines attracted the attention of German aviation aces when they were displayed in local competitions. Veteran pilots who briefly flew them would step out of the cockpit with an expression their comrades had never seen before, the expression of someone who has just realized that something they thought impossible is real. The maneuverability of the flying wing, the absence of drag from a conventional tail, the immediate response to controls, everything was radically different from what those pilots had experienced. The Horten brothers continued working. They designed the Ho-2, Ho-3, Ho-4, Ho-5, Ho-6, improving each generation without detailed blueprints, without wind tunnels, without academic aeronautical mathematicians. Reimar designed from intuition and direct observation of test flights. What he could not measure, he guessed, with a precision his contemporaries did not know whether to admire or fear. In 1943, as the situation on the Eastern Front had already begun to deteriorate irreversibly, Hermann Göring was searching for solutions. He summoned the main German aviation firms with a requirement that sounded like an impossible challenge: an aircraft capable of carrying 1,000 kilograms of bombs over 1,000 kilometers at a cruising speed of 1,000 kilometers per hour. The project was informally called the 1000-1000-1000. Messerschmitt attempted it, Heinkel attempted it, Junkers attempted it. The Horten brothers, called to Luftwaffe headquarters, presented the blueprints for the Ho-9, their jet-powered flying wing. Göring looked at the photographs and rose from his chair. "Build it, construct that aircraft, and let me see if it flies." Half an hour after the start of the meeting, he allocated 500,000 Reichsmarks in initial funding and left the room without saying anything else. The first prototype of the Ho-9, without engines, flew successfully in 1944. The second prototype, the Ho-9 Phi-2, now fitted with two Junkers Jumo 004B turbojet engines, took off on February 2, 1945, and reached speeds exceeding 800 kilometers per hour in early test flights. An enthusiastic Luftwaffe ordered immediate mass production. The production model would receive the official designation HO-229. The manufacturer would be Gotha Wagenfabrik in Gotha, Thuringia. 20 units were ordered. But the HO-229 never saw combat. The war ended before it could. What did reach the end of the war, however, was the third prototype, the Ho-9 Phi-3, which American forces discovered at the Gotha Wagenfabrik facilities in Friedrichroda on April 14, 1945. The aircraft was 80% complete. It was dismantled and shipped to the United States under Operation Seahorse, the naval equivalent of the better-known Operation Paperclip. The Ho-9 Phi-3 arrived in the United Kingdom for preliminary evaluation at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough and was later transferred to Wright Field and Freeman Field in the United States. Since 1952, it has been part of the collections of the Smithsonian Institution, where it was restored between 2015 and 2017. Here begins the technical mystery that still divides engineers today. In 1983, Reimar Horten published the book Nurflügel, Die Geschichte der Horten-Flugzeuge 1933 bis 1960, written in collaboration with Peter Selinger. In it, he claimed for the first time that he had deliberately incorporated into the structure of the Ho-9 a mixture of sawdust, charcoal and glue between the layers of plywood forming the wing surfaces. The stated purpose: to absorb radar waves and make the aircraft invisible to Allied detection systems. He was describing, in the terminology of the time, what modern engineers call radar-absorbent material, a fundamental component of stealth technology. In 2009, Northrop Grumman, the manufacturer of the American stealth bomber B-2 Spirit, funded a National Geographic documentary that included a study of the radar-absorbing properties of the HO-229. For the study, a full-scale wooden replica of the HO-9V2 was built using glue impregnated with carbon material between the plywood layers. Northrop engineers illuminated the replica with radar signals at frequencies used by the British chain home systems of 1944 and measured the resulting radar signature. The result was striking. The replica exhibited a significantly reduced radar cross-section compared to a conventional aircraft of similar size. Northrop Grumman concluded that, with the combination of flying wing design and construction materials, the Ho-9 would have been nearly invisible to British radar of the time. However, the Smithsonian reached more nuanced conclusions. During the restoration of the Ho-9V3 between 2015 and 2017, conservators used electron microscopy, X-ray diffraction, and Fourier transform spectroscopy on the aircraft's wooden layers. They specifically searched for carbon particles or any radar-absorbing material in the adhesive between layers. They found no conclusive evidence of the carbon impregnation Reimar had described. The analyses showed an increase in dielectric constant in the adhesive layer at the wing's leading edge, which is consistent with an attempt to modify material properties, but the amount of carbon present, if any, was below the safe detection thresholds. The final result of the Smithsonian studies was inconclusive. It cannot be confirmed that the original HO-9V3 contained radar-absorbing materials, nor can it be entirely ruled out that such materials existed in concentrations too low for available analytical methods or that they were part of production designs that were never built. Russell Lee, curator of aeronautics at the Smithsonian and author of Only the Wing, Reimar Horten's epic quest to stabilize and control the all-wing aircraft, acknowledged that the story could not be definitively closed. What is confirmed by Northrop Grumman's analysis is that the flying wing shape itself, independent of materials, produces a radar signature approximately 20% lower than that of a conventional fighter, such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109. A larger aircraft detected as if it was smaller. In the radar systems of the time, that 20% could mean the difference between being detected early enough to be intercepted and crossing the operator's screen without triggering an alarm. As for the question of what the 11,000-kilometer range of the Ho-18 was intended for, the strategic bomber that Niemeyer commissioned from the Horten brothers in December 1944, that distance corresponds to a round trip between a base in continental Europe and the city of New York without refueling. Goering told the Hortens in the February 1945 meeting that he needed to reach the North American continent. He did not explain what the aircraft was supposed to carry. The Hortens would learn the answer months later when it became known that the Nazis had been conducting nuclear research and that the designers of the A-9-A-10 project, the New York missile conceived by Wernher von Braun, were considering warheads whose weight corresponded exactly to the payload the Ho-18 would have been capable of carrying. Jack Northrop never replied to the letter Walter Horten sent him from Germany in 1946, requesting to continue his career in the United States. Walter died in 1998. Reimar, who had emigrated to Argentina where he designed gliders until his final years, died in 1994. The Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit, the most advanced stealth bomber in the Western world at the time of this account, was unveiled to the public on November 22, 1988 in Palmdale, California. Its silhouette, a tailless flying wing with a slight curvature along the trailing edge, is the same as the sketches the Horten brothers displayed at pre-war gliding competitions in interwar Germany. In the records of the interrogation that U.S. intelligence services conducted of Dr. Ernst Schaefer in 1946, there is a section that has still not been fully declassified. Schaefer recalled his first encounter with Himmler and described how the Reichsführer SS specifically asked him about the Kala Chakra, the Tibetan tantric ritual which, according to Buddhist tradition, transforms its initiates into invincible spiritual warriors. Schaefer said he gave Himmler a detailed description of the ritual. He also said that Himmler read it with the seriousness of someone taking operational notes. The Kala Chakra, or Wheel of Time, is one of the most complex sacred texts of Tibetan Tantric Buddhism. Its initiation lasts several days and involves practices of visualization, purification, and spiritual commitment. For Tibetan lamas, the Kala Chakra is closely linked to Shambhala, the mystical realm from which, according to prophecy, a warrior king will emerge to defeat evil in the final battle at the end of time. Himmler had read about Shambhala in European occult sources that linked that legend to the concept of Agartha, the subterranean kingdom inhabited by spiritual masters of a superior race. The mission of the Horten aircraft to Berlin in 1944 was not the only late expedition of the regime into the spiritual world. Himmler also sent Colonel Otto Skorzeny, the same SS officer who in September 1943 had rescued Mussolini from his imprisonment at Gran Sasso with only 9 men in gliders, to carry out a nighttime expedition to Montségur in March 1944. What Skorzeny was looking for, what he found or did not find, has not been established from any available archive. The presence of the Kala Chakra in the SS ideology connects with another unsolved enigma. In the hall of the Obergruppenführer at Wewelsburg, the Black Sun has 12 rays. The number 12 is repeated throughout the ritual architecture of the castle: 12 columns, 12 pedestals, 12 plates on the Arthurian table. The Kala Chakra tradition also organizes its cosmology around the number 12. No one has been able to confirm whether the correspondence is coincidental or intentional. The designers of the castle destroyed their files before the Allies arrived. On March 25, 1945, the submarine U-234 set sail from the port of Kiel, accompanied by several escort vessels and 3 coastal Type 23 U-boats. It was a Type XB submarine, the largest ever built by the Kriegsmarine, originally designed as a mine layer and later converted into a long-range cargo submarine. It displaced 1,735 tons surfaced and 2,143 tons submerged. Its commander was Captain Lieutenant Johann Heinrich Fehler, known in the Navy by the nickname Dynamite. Its first and only wartime mission was bound for Japan. The vessel arrived at the Norwegian port of Kristiansand 2 days later. There it suffered a minor collision with another U-boat during snorkel trials, was repaired, refueled, and finally departed for Japan on April 15, 1945. It traveled submerged at snorkel depth for the first 16 days. After that, when Fehler judged that ocean conditions and the persistent storm made it sufficiently safe, it began traveling on the surface. The U-234's cargo weighed 240 tons. It included classified technical blueprints, examples of the most advanced electric torpedoes of the Kriegsmarine, a Henschel HS-293 guided glider bomb, the disassembled fuselage of a Messerschmitt Me-262, the first operational jet fighter in history, air defense radar equipment, documentation on turbine propulsion systems, and, in the vertical mine tubes of the hull, something that did not appear in the official manifest. Deck officer Wolfgang Hirschfeld later described decades afterward in the book Hirschfeld, The Story of a U-Boat NCO, published in 1997, having personally seen the loading of the submarine's most sensitive material. These were approximately 50 lead containers, 9 inches per side, about 22 centimeters, each painted with the letters U-235 in white. 2 officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, traveling as passengers, Air Captain Genzo Shoji and Naval Captain Hideo Tomonaga, were seated on a crate on the forward deck, marking the containers with Japanese characters on brown paper glued with gum. The official cargo manifest listed them as containing U-Puder, uranium powder. Also aboard were 12 high-ranking passengers, including Luftwaffe Lieutenant General Ulrich Kessler, wearing a monocle and a leather coat down to his ankles, whose presence turned U-234 into a matter of state rather than an ordinary naval operation. On May 4, 1945, the U-234 intercepted fragmented BBC transmissions reporting Hitler's death. The following day, direct messages arrived from Dönitz, the new German head of state, ordering all submarines at sea to surface and surrender to the nearest Allied forces. Fowler calculated his position. He was in the North Atlantic, equidistant from Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States. He chose the Americans. The two Japanese officers, informed of the surrender, requested morphine on board and administered lethal doses to themselves. Their bodies were consigned to the sea before the submarine reached port. On May 14, 1945, the American destroyer USS Sutton intercepted the U-234 south of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. An American crew took control of the submarine and piloted it to the naval shipyard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where the U-boats U-805, U-873, and U-1228 had already surrendered. The arrival of the U-234 became a front-page event. Journalists who had set up their cameras on the pier were kept at a distance by Marines armed with specific orders not to allow anyone to approach, under threat of being shot if they did not comply. The American intelligence summary of May 19, 1945, classified as secret, listed the U-234's cargo as including blueprints, weapons, medical supplies, instruments, lead, mercury, caffeine, steel, optical glass, and brass. Uranium did not appear on any line of that document. It had disappeared from the record before the record was written. Historian Joseph Scalia, who investigated the case with access to declassified naval documents in the 1990s, found in the archives of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard a cable describing the uranium containers as gold-lined cylinders, a storage method that nuclear physicists of the time used exclusively for material with a high concentration of U-235 to prevent oxidation contamination. Raw or lightly enriched uranium did not require such treatment. Only material close to weapons-grade purity needed that level of protection. Major John Lansdale, former security chief of the Manhattan Project, stated in 1995 that the uranium from the U-234 was sent directly to the enrichment facilities of the Clinton Engineer Works in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where it was processed as part of the weapons program. The Oak Ridge facilities used electromagnetic calutrons to enrich uranium-235. Production records from those facilities, examined by researcher Carter Heydrich and published in his book Critical Mass, How Nazi Germany Surrendered Enriched Uranium for the United States Atomic Bomb, show a notable increase in enriched uranium production in the weeks following June 14, 1945, the date on which the second American naval officer, trainer and technician Smith, held a telephone conversation about the fate of the U-234 uranium. Eric Jeter, the chief metallurgist at Los Alamos, had projected in early 1945 that the laboratories would have access to only about 15 kilograms of enriched uranium by May of that year. The Little Boy bomb, of gun-type design, required approximately 50 kilograms of uranium-235 at 90% purity. The gap between what was available and what was needed was the reason the uranium bomb program had been on the brink of failure for months. Historian Heydrich documented that metallurgist Edward Hamel, who worked at the Metallurgical Laboratory in Chicago where the components of the bomb core were manufactured, stated that very little enriched uranium reached the laboratory until 2 or 3 weeks before the bomb was dropped. The Little Boy bomb fell on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The timelines align with the hypothesis that uranium from the U-234, processed at Oak Ridge in June, reached Los Alamos in July and was assembled into the bomb that destroyed the Japanese city in August. However, the United States government has not confirmed this causal chain. The inventory records of fissile materials for the months of May through August 1945 at Oak Ridge and Los Alamos have not been fully released. When independent researchers have requested them under the U.S. Freedom of Information Act, the Department of Defense has responded that their disclosure would cause serious harm to national security and national prestige. A response of this nature, issued in 1999, more than 50 years after the events, has its own mysteries. The U-234 was sunk on November 20, 1947, as a torpedo training target approximately 40 miles northeast of Provincetown, Cape Cod. Classified documents related to its most sensitive cargo remained restricted throughout the Cold War and were partially released starting in the 1990s. Of all the technological mysteries of the Third Reich, the Bell is the one that most divides historians between those who take it seriously and those who dismiss it as post-war mythology. And yet the sources are not entirely fabricated. The Polish journalist and researcher Igor Witkowski published a book in 2000 titled The Truth About the Wunderwaffe, in which he described a device called Die Glocke, the bell, whose existence was allegedly mentioned by SS General Jakob Sporenberg during a Polish interrogation in 1950. Sporenberg was executed in Poland that same year for war crimes committed in Lublin. According to the account transcribed by Witkowski, the bell was an apparatus approximately 2.5 meters in diameter and 3 meters high, bell-shaped, made of a metal with unusual properties. Inside it, 2 cylinders rotated in opposite directions, containing a substance described as Zerum 525, a violet-colored material Sporenberg described as similar to heavy mercury. The device generated an energy field within a radius of 150 to 200 meters, which reportedly produced unprecedented physical effects: rapid decomposition of organic matter, the death of small animals within minutes, severe disorientation in human operators, and what several engineers allegedly involved in the project described as anomalies in the flow of time within the generated field. The project was allegedly placed under the direct supervision of SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, the engineer who also oversaw the production of V-2 rockets at the underground Mittelwerk facilities, built using forced labor from concentration camps. Kammler disappeared at the end of the war. His whereabouts were never established. One version places him dead in Prague in May 1945. Another claims he was evacuated to the United States under Operation Paperclip, the program through which American intelligence services recruited more than 1,600 German scientists between 1945 and 1959. The underground facility where the Bell experiments were allegedly conducted was called Der Riese, the Giant, and was located in the Sudeten Mountains in the Lower Silesia region, now in Poland. The complex consisted of a network of tunnels carved beneath several mountains, with more than 8 kilometers of documented galleries and a central reinforced concrete structure with a circular plan that local researchers call the Henge, due to its superficial resemblance to Stonehenge. The Henge exists. It can be visited in the Polish municipality of Ludwikowice-Kłodzkie. It measures approximately 30 meters in diameter, is made of concrete with thicknesses between 1.5 and 2 meters, has 12 columns, and in its dome there are metal anchors that no one has been able to link to any known industrial equipment of the period. The archives describing what specific project was carried out in that complex were destroyed. No surviving German document mentions the term Die Glocke. What does exist are records indicating that in April 1945 something extraordinary occurred in the vicinity of the site, an episode that Witkowski describes as the only known example in the history of World War II of the mass execution of highly qualified scientific personnel by the SS themselves. 62 scientists and engineers working in secret installations in the Lower Silesia region were executed by their own guards in the days preceding the arrival of Soviet troops. Their names were never published in any Allied report. Their experiments, if there were any, died with them. On May 22, 1942, physician Kurt Plötner carried out the first in a series of experiments at the Dachau concentration camp that were not uncovered during the Nuremberg trials because the specific records had been destroyed. Plötner was an SS doctor investigating a very specific question: whether it was possible to use pharmacological substances to suppress an individual's will and make them speak without being able to lie or resist questioning. The drug he used was mescaline, a natural alkaloid extracted from the peyote cactus, used since pre-Columbian times in ritual ceremonies in northern Mexico. In high doses, mescaline produces hallucinations, disruption of the perception of time and space, and in some cases, states of extreme suggestibility. Plötner's experiments at Dachau were recorded in a single partial report discovered by the Allies in 1945 and classified by American intelligence services. For decades, that report remained in restricted archives. When it was partially declassified, it revealed that Plötner had administered mescaline to camp prisoners without their knowledge, mixed into coffee or soup, and subjected the subjects to filmed interrogations. The results were, according to the report itself, inconsistent. Some subjects entered states of complete disinhibition and spoke uncontrollably. Others became aggressive or fell into states of panic that made interrogation impossible. Plötner concluded that mescaline was not the pharmacological agent he was seeking, but that its hallucinogenic properties opened lines of research in other directions. The connection between the Dachau experiments and the American MK-Ultra program, launched by the CIA in 1953, has been documented by historian John Marks in his book The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. Marks established that several of the scientists recruited under Operation Paperclip had worked on pharmacological experiments during the war, and that their research provided methodological foundations for American mind control programs. Dr. Walter Schreiber, head of German military medicine during the war, was evacuated to the United States in 1951, despite protests from Nuremberg prosecutor Telford Taylor, who had documented his involvement in prisoner experiments. The full archives of the SS pharmacological program at Dachau have not been entirely declassified. What was destroyed in 1945 cannot be recovered. What was classified by the Americans in 1945 and 1946 remains the subject of partially denied declassification requests. In November 1944, pilots of the US 415th Night Fighter Squadron submitted reports that their command could not easily classify. They were flying missions over northeastern France, still under German occupation, when they began to see lights. They were not enemy aircraft, not flares. They were luminous spheres, generally red or white, that moved at speeds no known aircraft could match, and that seemed to accompany or follow Allied planes at varying distances, never attacking. The name the pilots gave them was taken from a popular wartime comic strip, Smilin' Jack, where a slang term described a character with strange powers, Foo Fighters. Reports multiplied throughout 1944 and 1945. British, American, and Australian pilots submitted dozens of independent accounts describing similar phenomena over Germany, France, and Italy. The descriptions shared consistent physical details. The lights moved at impossible speeds, changed direction without deceleration, left no visible propulsion trail, and vanished abruptly without trace. In no case did they attack Allied aircraft. Italian researcher Renato Vesco published evidence in the 1960s suggesting that the Foo Fighters were not natural phenomena or optical illusions, but a real German weapon known internally as Feuerball, fireball, developed in Luftwaffe facilities in Wiener Neustadt, Austria. The Feuerball was allegedly a turbine-propelled, pilotless device coated in an incendiary substance that burned without consuming the craft, capable of autonomous flight and designed to follow Allied aircraft and disrupt their radar and ignition systems. Former officer Haberstroh, interviewed in a monastery room by Spanish researchers in the late 20th century, specifically recalled luminous spheres carried beneath Messerschmitt jet aircraft and released against enemy formations, igniting like fireballs in the air. His description corresponded technically with Vesco's documentation. It also corresponded with Allied pilot reports. There is also a second technical candidate, ball lightning plasma, that can form naturally around aircraft engines under specific atmospheric conditions. But Allied pilots who submitted the most detailed reports were veterans with thousands of flight hours who were well familiar with natural atmospheric phenomena. No specific archives of the Feuerball project or any equivalent Luftwaffe turbine-powered drone program have been found. Radar inventor Robert Watson Watt stated after the war that the Germans had been working on airborne electromagnetic interference devices whose technical documentation was destroyed in the final months of the conflict. Reports of Foo Fighters remain in United States Air Force archives, classified as unidentified. At the Reich University of Strasbourg, a city that Germany had formally incorporated into its territory in 1940, the anatomist August Hirt occupied a laboratory on the second floor of the medical faculty building. He was a professor and a member of the SS with the rank of Hauptsturmführer. In late 1941, he wrote to Wolfram Sievers, executive director of the Ahnenerbe, with a proposal. Hirt wanted to build a collection of Jewish skeletons. His justification was scientific. He claimed that the craniofacial anatomy of Jews had never been systematically documented in life because the only specimens available to science were those of deceased individuals whose decomposition distorted measurements. If living individuals were available and precisely measured before death, the resulting collection would be, in his words, of unique and incalculable scientific value. Himmler read the proposal and approved it. In 1943, Bruno Beger, the same anthropologist who had measured 376 Tibetans during Schaefer's expedition, selected 115 detainees at Auschwitz, men and women of various ethnic backgrounds. The 115 were transported in August 1943 to the Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp in Alsace, approximately 80 kilometers southwest of Strasbourg. There they were gassed. Their bodies were taken to Hert's laboratory, where the professor prepared them for preservation. When Allied troops approached Strasbourg in September 1944, Hert ordered the destruction of the corpses. The destruction was incomplete. American soldiers found the remains of 86 bodies in a semi-preserved chemical state in the basement of the anatomy laboratory. The Nuremberg proceedings documented the case. Bruno Beger was tried in Germany in 1971, nearly 30 years later, and sentenced to 3 years of suspended imprisonment. August Hert was never tried, as he committed suicide in June 1945 in the Bavarian forests. The mystery is not the crime. The crime is documented. The mystery is what Hert intended to prove with that collection. The scientific writings he would have produced from it never existed or were destroyed. The racial hypothesis that justified the project was never published. The question Hert claimed his collection would answer, this question about the alleged anatomical differences of Jews, never had, and could never have had, any valid scientific answer because the premise was scientifically void from the outset. But Hert believed it, and the regime financed it. On May 10, 1941, at Augsburg Air Base, Deputy Führer of the Nazi Party Rudolf Hess, dressed in a Luftwaffe uniform, boarded a Messerschmitt Bf 110 and took off alone heading northwest. He was 47 years old, had spent 4 months secretly planning what he was about to do, and told no one where he was going. He flew for 4 hours over the North Sea. As he approached Scotland, he parachuted into Renfrewshire, injuring his ankle on landing, and was captured by a local farmer named David McLean with a pitchfork. He asked to speak with the Duke of Hamilton, whom he had met years earlier at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. The official reasons for the flight have been explained in multiple ways over the 85 years since. The most widely accepted version is that Hess acted on his own, driven by his belief that Britain could be persuaded to sign a separate peace before Germany invaded the Soviet Union, which would occur 5 weeks later. Hess had been deeply influenced by his mentor Karl Haushofer, the geostrategist who taught that the Anglo-Saxons shared Aryan racial heritage with the Germans and that war between the two peoples was a historical mistake. However, a declassified British intelligence memorandum published in 2017 complicates this account. The document, produced by MI6, suggests that Hess may have believed he had tacit, informal authorization for his peace mission, that an unofficial channel may have existed prior to the flight, and that its later denial was the result of a political decision taken after Hess was already on British soil. Hess also made his decision to fly on May 10, 1941, for a reason rarely mentioned by conventional historians. On that day, according to astrologers within Himmler's circle, a rare planetary alignment occurred which, in the predictive systems regularly consulted by several high-ranking regime officials, indicated a unique opportunity for decisive action. Hess was imprisoned in Britain, tried at Nuremberg, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was held in Spandau prison in West Berlin, where he remained the sole prisoner for 21 years. He died on August 17, 1987, at the age of 93, under circumstances later described as suspicious by an independent commission. The autopsy report noted that the electrical cord allegedly used in his hanging was too short for a man of his age and physical condition to have done so without external assistance. The full transcripts of British interrogations of Hess between 1941 and 1945 have not been fully declassified. On May 9, 1945, 1 day after Germany's formal surrender, SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler vanished from history. He did not die in combat, he was not captured, he was not tried. He did not appear in any refugee camp lists, he was not found in any casualty records, he simply was not there. In the final 2 years of the war, Kammler was the most powerful man in the regime after Hitler, Himmler, and possibly Bormann. He was the architect who designed the gas chambers and crematoria of Auschwitz-Birkenau. He was the engineer who oversaw the production of V-2 rockets at the Mittelwerk underground facilities, where prisoners from the Dora concentration camp worked under such extreme brutality that mortality during tunnel construction exceeded 10% per month. He was responsible for the Reich's most secret weapons projects, including, according to various sources, the device known as Die Glocke. In the spring of 1945, Kammler negotiated with American intelligence officers. American historian Tom Agoston documented in his book Blunder: How the US Gave Away Nazi Super-Secrets to Russia, 1985, that Kammler offered the Americans access to the Reich's most advanced technology in exchange for personal protection. Other researchers have suggested that Kammler had access to the full plans of the German nuclear program, secret aviation projects, and possibly records of experiments that no senior Nazi official could have survived had they been made public. The official version states that Kammler died in Prague on May 9, 1945, possibly by suicide or executed by his own subordinates. No verifiable eyewitness to his death has ever been identified. No document certifying his death was found by the Allies. The Allied War Crimes Commission closed Kammler's case in 1947, stating only that he was likely dead at the end of the war without specifying method, exact location, or circumstances. Operation Paperclip recruited 1,600 German scientists and engineers between 1945 and 1959. The files of several of them were redacted before their incorporation into the American scientific program to remove references to their Nazi-era activities. Historian Annie Jacobson, in her book Operation Paperclip, 2014, documented this systematic expurgation process, but was unable to identify Kammler among the recruits. If Kammler went to the United States, he lived under a false identity until his natural death, with no record of it. If he was executed in Prague, there is no record of that either. He remains the highest-ranking officer of the Third Reich, whose fate at the end of the war is still completely unknown. The Thule Society was not what it appeared to be. Registered in the Munich Registry of Societies as the Association for the Study of Germanic Antiquity, it was in reality the Bavarian branch of the Germanenorden Wallwarte of the Holy Grail, an occult Völkisch order founded in 1912 that combined racial anti-Semitism with practices derived from Freemasonry, Hermeticism, and Germanic rune traditions. Its Munich founder was Rudolf von Sebottendorf, a man whose biography contains layers that have not been fully verified. It is known that he traveled to Egypt, where, according to his own account, he was initiated into Memphis rites by members of the Termudi family, Jewish Freemasons of an esoteric orientation. It is known that he inherited his occult library, and that within it he found notes describing meditative exercises that he adopted as the basis for Thule's internal practice. It is known that the Society's emblem was a swastika between swords and garlands, and that its members' motto was, "Remember that you are German. Keep your blood pure." What is not known with certainty is the extent of Thule's inner circle. The existence of multiple concentric levels of initiation was inherent to its structure. The first circle consisted of regular members, professionals, aristocrats, and military officers in post-war Munich. The second consisted of initiates in the group's so-called spiritual work. The third, of which researchers only have indirect references, was the group Sebottendorf referred to as the Masters. Among Thule members who later gained political relevance were Rudolf Hess, Alfred Rosenberg, Dietrich Eckart, and Anton Drexler, founder of the German Workers' Party, which Hitler transformed into the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Thule Society partially financed the purchase of the Völkischer Beobachter, which became the official newspaper of Nazism. Munich police chief Ernst Pöhner was part of the inner circle. Dietrich Eckart was Hitler's first mentor. He died in December 1923, 1 month after the failed beer hall putsch. As he lay dying on a Munich street, he told 2 of his followers, "Do not mourn me. We have given him the means to communicate with them." He did not finish the sentence. The archives of the Thule Society, if they ever existed as formal records, have never surfaced. Its initiation rituals, according to fragmentary testimonies that have reached researchers, included practices that no surviving member of the war was able to describe in detail before any tribunal. Historian Nicholas Goodrick Clark, in his work The Occult Roots of Nazism, 1985, documented the history of the society with the highest available academic rigor and concluded that the true extent of its ritual practices remains impossible to determine from surviving archives. On December 5, 1941, 2 days before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, an American military convoy left Beijing carrying a fossil collection of incalculable scientific value. The remains of Sinanthropus pekinensis, the Peking Man, discovered in the Jokudian cave excavations between 1923 and 1937. The fossils included skull fragments, teeth and bones from approximately 30 to 40 individuals of a human species that lived around 500,000 years ago. The convoy reached the port of Qinhuangdao on December 8th, the same day the Japanese Empire declared war on the United States. Japanese soldiers arrested the American Marines at the port. The fossils never reached the ship waiting to transport them. They disappeared. They have never been recovered. The Nazis were not directly responsible for this disappearance, but the Ahnenerbe had shown active interest in the Peking Man fossils for years. Nazi paleontologists were required to interpret any fossil evidence in terms that supported Aryan theory, and the Jokudian remains represented a problematic anomaly for their theoretical framework, too primitive to fit any narrative of racial superiority, yet too human to be ignored. The Ahnenerbe had attempted in 1939 to obtain permission to study the fossils directly in Beijing. The Chinese government denied the request. When Japan occupied northern China, several German intelligence units were working closely with the Japanese. Whether the fossils were deliberately intercepted by one of those units or simply lost in the chaos of shifting sovereignty is something that no available archive can establish. What is verifiable is that the international paleontological community has been searching for the Peking fossils for more than 80 years without success. Several investigations, including one conducted in the 1990s with the cooperation of the Chinese government, have traced all possible leads without finding any solid evidence. The plaster casts made of the originals before the war are all that remain. Dozens of Nazi war criminals, including Adolf Eichmann, the direct organizer of the Holocaust, Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon, and Franz Stangl, commander of the Treblinka extermination camp, managed to escape Europe at the end of the war and live for years or decades in South America under false identities. This escape system was called ratlines, ratlines, by the Nazis themselves. The term first appeared in American intelligence documents in 1947. The ratlines were not a centralized organization, but a network of networks, with multiple routes converging at specific transfer points. The best documented route passed through Switzerland, crossed the Italian Alps toward Genoa or Rome, and from there shipped fugitives to Argentina, Brazil, or Paraguay, using forged documents or legitimate papers issued by the International Red Cross at the request of intermediaries who acted as contacts between fugitives and the ports of departure. Partially declassified International Committee of the Red Cross documents from the 1990s showed that the organization issued more than 200,000 travel documents between 1945 and 1951, in many cases without requiring proof of the applicant's identity. Red Cross officials admitted that the system was systematically exploited by war criminals. The role of the Vatican is the most sensitive and least fully documented aspect of the ratlines. Croatian Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the Pontifical Teutonic Institute of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, verifiably assisted several Nazis in escaping. Hudal admitted this in his memoirs published in 1976, stating that he did so out of anti-communist conviction and the belief that many of those pursued were victims of Allied revenge. Vatican archives covering the 1943 to 1955 period related to assistance for German wartime refugees have not been fully declassified. The Catholic Church partially opened its archives from that period in 2020, but restrictions on the most sensitive documents remain. The mystery is not whether the ratlines existed. It is how many escaped, with what institutional assistance, and how many of those who did escape continue to operate within intelligence networks, scientific programs, or post-war political structures under identities that no researcher has been able to fully verify. On October 13, 1918, in a sector of the Belgian front south of Wervik, British artillery launched a mustard gas attack on German positions. Among those affected was Gefreiter Adolf Hitler, who was temporarily blinded. He was evacuated to the military hospital in Passwalk, Pomerania, where he remained until November of that year. What occurred in Pacewalk between Hitler's admission and his recovery remains the subject of historical debate that is still unresolved. The version Hitler himself recorded in Mein Kampf is that of the soldier who, in the hospital, hears the news of Germany's defeat and experiences a moment of revelation that transforms his paralysis into a mission. In his own words, he regained his sight while deciding to enter politics in order to save Germany. The restoration of vision and the revelation of his destiny occurred simultaneously. The physician who treated Hitler in Pacewalk was psychiatrist Edmund Forster, a specialist in cases of hysterical blindness caused by war trauma, with no verifiable organic cause. Forster applied a hypnosis technique that in some cases could restore vision to patients whose blindness was psychogenic, suggesting to the patient the belief that they possessed special powers that would allow them to recover sight if they concentrated on their mission. The procedure was recorded in hospital archives. Hitler's first biographer, Rudolf Hess, wrote in 1936 that it should not surprise us to consider the possibility of hysterical blindness and that medical reports that might clarify the matter would likely not be found. In 1933, when the Nazi Party came to power, Dr. Edmund Forster came under pressure from the Gestapo. His notes on the Hitler case were confiscated. Forster died on September 10, 1933, officially by suicide, less than 6 months after Hitler became Chancellor. He was 44 years old. His files on the Pacewalk case never resurfaced. What exactly Hitler experienced in that hospital room in November 1918, and whether it was the result of hypnosis that convinced him of a supernatural mission, is something that cannot be verified because the only people who knew the answer died before or during the war. In the final months of the war, when Allied bombing had already destroyed much of Germany's industrial capacity, engineers in surviving underground design offices continued producing projects. Some were extensions of existing technologies, others were speculative concepts of an ambition bordering on science fiction. The Sonnengewehr, the sun gun, belonged to the second category. The concept was developed from the work of scientist Hermann Oberth, one of the pioneers of modern rocketry and mentor to Wernher von Braun. In 1929, Oberth had published a theoretical description of how an orbital mirror of sufficient diameter could concentrate sunlight and direct it toward a point on Earth's surface with enough energy to generate temperatures above 4,000 degrees Celsius within a radius of several kilometers. German Wehrmacht engineers expanded upon this speculation during the war. Documents recovered by the Allies in 1945, including a Life magazine issue dated July 9, 1945, described a project involving an orbital mirror more than 1 kilometer in diameter, assembled in space from modules launched by rockets. The mirror would use concentrated sodium as reflective material. A ground-based control station would aim the system. The project never progressed beyond the conceptual stage. The technology required to launch materials into space and assemble them in orbit did not exist in 1945 and would not exist for decades. But the idea did exist. It had been seriously examined by engineers of the Reich, and documents describing it were collected and classified by American scientific intelligence services. Today, the Nazi sun gun is considered by historians of technology to be a conceptual precursor to directed energy weapons systems later explored by both the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. The HARP project in Alaska, an auroral research facility capable of heating the ionosphere, uses energetic principles that Luftwaffe designers of the Sonnengewehr would have recognized without difficulty. There is a figure in the origins of the Nazi movement whose story is so strange that several historians have wondered whether he might have been invented. He was not. Ignaz Trebitsch Lincoln was born in 1879 into a Jewish family in Pax, Hungary. He was ordained as a rabbi. He later converted to Protestantism, moved to England, was ordained as an Anglican minister, married an English woman, and was elected Member of Parliament in 1910 for the Liberal Party. He became the first foreign-born Jewish origin MP in the British Parliament. He also became a German spy during the First World War, then a British spy, then an American spy, then apparently an agent of no one or everyone, depending on who was asked. By 1919, Trebitsch Lincoln was in Munich. He participated in the failed Kapp Putsch of March 1920. According to some sources, he was the one who introduced Hitler to a Cologne banker seeking men capable of stabilizing Germany's political situation. If true, he would have been one of the earliest financial intermediaries of the future dictator. In 1933, as the Nazis were about to take power, Trebitsch Lincoln, by then converted to Buddhism and ordained as a monk under the name Fra Chao Chu, wrote an open letter to world leaders claiming that the King of the World, a supreme master governing the fate of nations from the Himalayas, would unleash unknown forces against those who disturbed cosmic order. He died in Shanghai in 1943. MI6 files on Trebitsch Lincoln remain partially classified. The exact nature of his relationship with the emerging Nazi movement, whether he was a deliberate agent of an intelligence service, whether he acted as a conscious or accidental catalyst for Nazism, whether his statements about the King of the World were coded intelligence communications or genuine belief, none of these questions have a complete documentary answer. In 2018, a researcher working in the archives of the Stasi, the secret service of the former German Democratic Republic, discovered a document that did not fit into any of the usual file categories. The internal reference was cryptic. It described a prisoner held under Soviet custody since the end of the war, identified in the records only as der Gesichtslose, the faceless one. The document indicated that the prisoner had been detained under NKVD authority, the Soviet intelligence service, and had never been officially registered in any prisoner of war documentation system. The Stasi document was a secondary reference, not the original file. The original file, if it existed, would be in the archives of the KGB, now the FSB in Russia. It has not been declassified. Who did this document describe? The most widely discussed hypothesis among researchers is that it referred to a high-ranking Nazi officer whose political identity or knowledge of certain secret programs made him too valuable for the Soviets to disclose publicly, but also too dangerous to release. Several candidates have been proposed. The first is Hans Kammler himself, whose fate at the end of the war remains one of the most persistent mysteries previously discussed. The second is Martin Bormann, whose death in Berlin was confirmed by DNA analysis in 1998, but whose decades-long disappearance generated a chain of alleged sightings in South America, later quietly investigated by the CIA without verifiable results. The third, and most speculative, is an individual connected to secret technological programs whose identity the Soviets may have chosen to conceal in order to protect scientific projects derived from his knowledge. The Stasi document was authenticated by two independent graphologists as having been produced in the GDR between 1955 and 1975. Beyond that, nothing can be stated with certainty. The nameless prisoner in Soviet archives remains one of the most ambiguous and potentially significant mysteries left by the Third Reich. The possibility that someone who knew too much may have remained alive, imprisoned and silenced for decades after the regime that created him was defeated.